Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with our friend Howie Singer. Howie's book, titled Key Changes, The 10 Times Technology Transformed the Music Industry, co-authored with Bill Rosenblatt, was published by Oxford University Press. Howie's an expert on innovation and data analytics in the music industry who played a leading role in the transition to digital music delivery. At Warner Music Group, he served as SVP and Chief Strategic Technologist, analyzing new business models and services. He also has taught a graduate class on data analysis in the music industry at NYU, and how he spent the first part of his career at Bell Labs and AT&T, where he co-founded A to B Music, an early digital music startup. And many years ago, Howie and I worked together at Bell Labs also. You can learn more about the book at Oxford University Press. So Howie, welcome and congratulations on all your great work.
Thanks. Thanks so much for doing this.
Well, it's really great to reconnect after, having known each other for so many years. And, we're both kind of, to some degree, in the publishing industry, or at least publishing books. So what else would you like people to know about you?
I guess the only thing is that in addition to teaching and uh, writing the book, I also am still consulting on tech issues for the music industry, for the Recording Industry Association. I'm on the advisory board for a startup that looks at streaming fraud, which is a data issue. And so, between that and teaching, and trying to have some fun as well, not working full time anymore, I'm pretty busy, which I like. I'm not one of those to sit around. So I like, and my wife is semi-retired too, so the two of us keeping busy is good for us.
Absolutely. I hear you. I totally agree. So, as I mentioned, Javi and I go way back, and I think we first met when I was at Bell Labs Indianapolis, and Howie was at Bell Labs in Holmdel, New Jersey, which I ended up at later. So what do you remember the most from your early days at Bell Labs?
I've thought about it a lot lately because the TV show Severance on Apple
Yes.
uses the building that we worked at, Bell Labs in Homedale, which now is called Bell Works. It's not associated with any remnant of the Bell system anymore. But they use it as the site for filming shots of the headquarters of the fictitious company that Severance is based on. There are people that come there just to tour the building now, to see
Yeah.
it, not because of the Bell Labs heritage, but of Lumen, the company in Severance. And what I remember feeling really, really lucky for a bunch of reasons when I first started at Bell Labs. First of all, it was a great place to work, as you know. There were just so many smart people there.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
that ended up upsetting some folks because they went from being the very top at whatever school they came from to maybe not being the top because, there were just so many smart people. I was able to start on a project that was directly related to my PhD and felt, like my first project, which was designing inventory control systems for phone center stores. These are the days when there wasn't a Verizon store and a T-Mobile store on every corner. The AT&T had never sold phones. They had leased phones. So they needed a new inventory control system. And, getting a terminal that connected to the computer my first day of work and not having to deal with punch cards. That's how old we are, Brian. And,
Yes, exactly.
the other thing is that Home Dell building was sort of the Googleplex of its day, right? In terms
Yeah.
of the food wasn't free. It was subsidized. So it wasn't like Google in that aspect. But in terms of facilities, a library and medical facility and sports programs for people to play volleyball or softball, or I didn't do it, but people had ski trips that they coordinated. It was
Yeah.
like any
Yeah.
activity you could think of because at its heyday, there were 7,000 people a day working there. And the environment was great. I recommend if anybody's interested in that history to read not my book, which covers the music industry, but The Idea Factory, which
Yeah.
tells the history of Bell Labs and the transistor and the cell phone and other things. And it was just a great place to be. And I remember feeling real lucky. And the last part of being lucky was that the other job offers I had, which were to be a professor somewhere, paid a lot less than the Bell Labs jobs. That was another reason to feel lucky.
it was an absolutely amazing place to work. And I mean, I share many of the same, things that you have highlighted, especially the really smart people. Um, that was just an amazing consolidation, point. At that point in time, it was before, Silicon Valley was anywhere near what it is today. And, it was just a high concentration of great people. So tell us about A to B Music and how that got started, because that was still while you were in the AT&T world.
Yeah, it was. It's sort of my last job at AT&T, and T, and you and I knew each other when we were in consumer products. And, I worked on when AT&T tried to get back into mobile phones, and we had video phones, the precursor of FaceTime on our
Right, right.
smartphone, and all those kinds of things. But the last job I had at AT&T was in an organization that was trying to take research technology and turn it into products and businesses, startups, intrapreneurial ventures inside
Right.
the company. And AT&T had thousands of incredible inventions, but was never particularly good at building new businesses, right? They struggled with that. And so having a dedicated team to work on that, and the people in research had been working on audio compression to take files of music, zeros and ones, off the CD and compress them down by a factor of 20 so they could send them over the network. And at that point, the network meant the phone network, not broadband. And so it took 12 minutes to send one song. But that was cheap. That was less time than driving to the store, to buy a CD. And a guy showed up and joined AT&T Solutions named Larry Miller, who now is the head of the music business program at NYU, where I teach. And he was also interested in starting new businesses. And so we put together what I had been working on and his expertise in the music industry. And we started pitching the music companies. This is 95, 96, several years before Napster, that music is going to go get delivered over networks, and you want to get into that business now. And of course, that's a difficult thing to convince those people to do when they still were making more money than they ever had in their history, mostly driven by the profits from the CD. So
Wow.
any profitable business always has a hard time shifting to something new. But, we called this internal startup A to B Music, which stood for atoms to bits, taking the atoms of physical goods and turning them to bits that flow over networks. And just to give you an example of how tough it was to pitch that and persuade people, people asked us, why are you calling it A to B Music? And I explained just the way I just told you. And the music executive said, don't ever call my music bits again. So we changed the meaning of the name, kept the name A to B Music, but then it meant the shortest distance from point A to point B
Oh,
was the
goodness.
network, as opposed to driving. So we could keep the name and the business cards and everything else, but we never just said your music is bits again, because they were upset by that.
Well, so, I mean, this was another classic case, just like so many others, of the innovator's dilemma. The book by Clayton Christensen, right?
Yes.
Where he goes through in great, detail and analysis of all these different companies that could not compete with themselves to cannibalize their expensive, profitable businesses.
Right. And that's why when people say, well, the music industry was so dumb when Napster came along and they did all these foolish things. And I said, true, but it's true for every business. Who made the electric car a real thing? It wasn't Ford. It wasn't Toyota. It was Elon Musk and Tesla that showed you could make a cost-effective electric car. It always is the other. Why? Because they were making hand over fist money with gas cars. So
Right.
it's always hard, as you say. The innovator's dilemma is not unique to music. And for me, the lucky part was it helped me make this sort of mid-career transition from being an engineer at Bell Labs to being somebody that understood technology in the music industry.
Yeah, yeah. That was so wonderful to see that happen. And so what happened with A to B? Where did that end up?
The plan was to spin it out of AT&T. We actually had somebody assigned from like corporate M&A to help us do that, because we had said this can't survive inside of AT&T. It needs to raise more money, first of all, because we're up against companies that are raising money from venture capitalists. And AT&T's been generous with the budgets, but you don't want to spend double what you're spending, which is at least what you have to do to get started. And so that was the plan. And then this is one of the reasons AT&T fails. Executive one, who was in favor of the spin out, was moved somewhere else. And executive two took over and said, we're not spitting this out of AT&T. We should just do this ourselves. And Larry and I and the 15 people that had planned to go out of AT&T with the spin out, I had already filed my retirement papers to leave AT&T, walked out the door. Right. And we joined another startup that was in this space. We were one of the companies that was thinking of investing in us if we spun out, helped us to find a new home, basically, in a startup that was funded by SoftBank and Microsoft. And so we joined this company called Reciprocal for a couple of years that was active in the same way, trying to do digital delivery of media. They had focused on books and publishing, not music publishing, but book publishing and ebook.
Really?
And they wanted to add entertainment to that portfolio, and so we became that part of the company. AW Music continued inside of AT&T, but never really succeeded in that incarnation of it. And we continued for a couple of years, and then we're ready to raise another round of financing when 9/11 happened, and that round of financing never closed, and the company we joined folded like many others in the dot-com bubble, and then things really got hurt at 9/11.
Yeah, and I went through the same thing. All the investment in the telecom, datacom, technology world really went away.
Yeah. So
for a while.
Those shares, you've done this too in startups, those shares in the startup ended up not being worth anything because when we joined this other company, we had shares. But where it also ended up was that I was now a person who knew the music industry to a degree that I hadn't before, at least not so much the music industry in the large, but the digital transformation of the music industry I was an expert in. And so when Warner Music in 2002 started looking for somebody with that background, literally 1,000 people applied for that job.
Wow.
And I got it, right?
Good for you.
Lucky. And I never would have gotten that job if I hadn't had that experience. So yes, AW Music financially didn't do necessarily what we hoped it would do, but it positioned me to get that job at Warner Music that I never would have had otherwise.
Very cool. Very cool. So, we've talked a lot about the technology disruption, both the music industry and the telecom industry that we've been through. How much do you see parallels between the two?
Well, I think you already covered the parallel, how hard it is for the successful people to make the change, right? So that is certainly a parallel. I mean, I even had in my notes the words innovator's dilemma, as you already used them. It's always hard to cannibalize your own business. But, this sort of gets to what's in the book, because one of the things I think that is true is that companies who are really healthy have a tough time making the change. Companies who, on the one hand, are healthy but see warning signs that things are going to head south make the change, right? And this has happened throughout the history of the music industry. MTV wanted music videos for free. Most of the labels didn't want to give them for free. Then there was a downturn in the industry, and suddenly music companies that weren't giving their videos away were giving their videos away because they saw value in the promotion. And today, streaming has brought the music industry back to health. It's still not as large as it was in the peak of the CD era if you count inflation, but the music industry is well aware of the slowdown in revenue growth from streaming, particularly in the developed nations. So US, UK, Germany, Japan, all those places where incidentally people pay more for their streaming subscription. Is it growing? Yes. Are there still new consumers to get to? Yes. But that growth is slowing. And the areas of the world where it's growing the fastest are India and Sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe. And wonderful to have more and more customers in those places. China's gone from not even being on the list of top revenue producers for the music industry worldwide to being number 5 over the course of the time I've been in the music industry. But each of those customers is in an economy that has far less disposable income, that the cost of having a smartphone and the mobile service to go with it is more expensive relative to their total income. So they get charged less. So the growth is coming from consumers who deliver less ARPU, average revenue per user, right? And the slowdown is coming from those. And all the music companies know this. And because of that, they're moving more quickly than they might have in the past to figure out the whole area of generative AI and do licensing. At the same time, they're suing people who they feel are doing things inappropriately. But, you know, the hope is that they will get to a mutually acceptable licensing agreement.
Well, the transition you just described sounds so much like the cellular industry was.
Right.
Sort of the penetration and the high cost of services and phones here in the U.S. That, you know, prevented its adoption early on in so many developing countries, which eventually changed too.
Right.
Very similar kind of rollout. So let's talk more about the book, because I mentioned the title is Key Changes, the 10 times technology transformed the music industry. How did you decide to become an author and write a book about this?
I remember thinking that some of the things I had lived through at AT&T were worthy of a book. I remember being on a trip to Japan to talk about bringing certain aspects of manufacturing back to the US. And we had a good big team of people, and it didn't go ahead. But I remember taking notes thinking this could be an interesting book if this succeeds. And when I was sitting at Warner Music, through the dawn of iTunes, through the start of Spotify, through the launch of YouTube, I said, this is a fascinating time, these changes that are happening. And I started taking notes and thought someday I'll write a book about this era of, you know, Napster and what happened to the music industry. I was fortunate, though. I stayed at Warner Music for 15 years. So by the time I left, there had been several books written about that phase of the industry, Appetite for Self-Destruction, just to name one, that was critical of the music industry, as you can tell by the title. And there were others that about the MP3 and all of that. So I had gradually shifted in my mind, well, I'll maybe write a book someday, but it'll be broader. It'll be about the entire history of the music industry and not just this era, because just as I told that story about MTV, I could tell you stories about, you know, the cylinder and the record, and the fact that the record, which sounded worse than the cylinder, won the format war. Why? Because consumers thought it was more convenient. Convenience always.
Isn't that crazy? Yet another instance of the innovation.
Edison didn't want to hear it because he said, but the cylinder sounds better, you know? So there were all these other stories that we could tell. And I was teaching at NYU by then. And when COVID hit, right? And I literally started writing. I went back to that folder with all my notes and I wrote 2 chapters. I wrote the chapter about the download era, and I wrote the chapter about the streaming era, both ones I had lived through, so I didn't have to quite research in the same way. And I sent it to people I knew in the industry. One of them was Bill Rosenblatt, who had been an author and wrote for Forbes and also is an adjunct professor at NYU where I teach. And Bill said, this is a great idea. I have 5 book ideas and this is better than any of them, number one. Number two, you told me this is going to be a textbook. Nobody writes textbook anymore. You should write a trade paperback, which can be used as a textbook, which is with NYU now. And 3, do you need any help? And knowing how long it had taken me to write those 2 chapters, I said, you betcha. And for example, he was much better versed about radio than I was. And so he wrote that chapter. So we divided up the chapters. Fortunately, Amazon made deliveries during COVID, so I could get books for research. Many of the university libraries made more stuff available electronically, so I could, get PDFs of books through NYU's library. And literally we spent, that year of lockdown basically writing this book.
Well, good timing for that, right? I mean, so, it's just kind of amazing to me. I know I try to think back to all the different forms music recording has taken. Can you do a quick summary of that for us?
Yeah, getting to the 10 is interesting, and they're not all physical formats, because what we really focused on were the things that were the dominant music experience, most of which were on physical media and now streaming and downloads, digital forms. But we really thought about the things that were the main music experience, because we'll come back to this. Every time there's a new format that becomes the main music experience, the industry changes. It's as if you have a big earthquake of the technologies coalescing to make something new. And if it takes off, and there have been lots of failures, right? Quadraphonic stereo was a thing at one time, never really became the main experience though. But when it becomes the main experience, there are aftershocks that percolate through the industry and change what artists do and change how the distribution channels work. And so the 10 things that we focused on were the phonograph, which really has to do with cylinders and those discs, the 78 disc, right? 78 RPM, so not very much material. Radio, which was not a physical format, but was the dominant music experience in part because of the Depression and the availability of, quote, free music once you had the radio. You didn't have to buy records anymore. Then the record returned when long playing records were invented. Then tape. Then we covered TV and MTV, because again, that became the dominant music experience for young fans, was the MTV. We talk about it as the MTV generation even, right?
Sure.
So we have television and MTV, then the compact disc, which again took the industry to enormous heights, which you and I lived through. And I'll just digress for 1 second to say that part of the reason it was such a huge revenue and profit generator is that people like you and me bought things we already owned a second time.
That's true. Absolutely.
Right? It came about in the early 80s, but if you liked Fleetwood Mac, you bought Rumors again. And so it wasn't only that people were buying new music from Madonna or Cyndi Lauper or Michael Jackson, they were also rebuying their entire collection, right? And so that's part of the reason that drove to new heights. So that was the download, the compact disc era. And then Napster happened in 99. That was the peak year for CDs, and it was downhill from there. Industry lost 40% of its revenues in 3 years. And it didn't start to pick up until what had now proven to be somewhat of a transitional format, the digital download, Apple and the iPod in the early 2000s. And it did make money, but CDs had been so profitable that the download never really replaced the continuing decline in CD revenue, which was so profitable. Then streaming video, we have the world of YouTube and TikTok now, which is distinct from streaming music in many ways. And then the last of the 10 is artificial intelligence, which plays a role in smart speakers, which is part of our music experience in the home now, as well as all the generative stuff that's the topic in the music industry these days. So those are the 10 formats we chose to focus on.
Wow. What a saga. You think about the decades, that all happened, and the changes that, whether you say it's the technology drives it or not, I mean, just tremendous changes to the industry.
Right.
Monumental. And the nice thing about that is that everybody listens to music, right? So not that everybody has experienced all those transitions, but at least a couple of them, right? I mean, even young folks.
At least a couple, and I wouldn't go so far as to say everyone, but everybody has, most people really identify with music, and typically, their peak music years or their teen years or college years. What is always true, and this is true for all of us, a song will come on and you'll say, oh, that was college, or, oh, that's when I met my wife. Right. And it's sort of like odors that trigger memories. Songs trigger memories. Right. And what's interesting today, of course, is that you pay for one monthly fee. You have the entire recorded music history available at your fingertips through one of these.
Isn't that crazy? That too
is really a remarkable experience. And it's a bargain. Right. We can complain about prices if we want, but it's an incredible bargain.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, you talk about the 6 C's. Could you list those for us and talk about their impact?
Sure. And the toughest part was coming up with phrases that started with the letter C, right? Because, and this gets back to the point, is that technologies coalesce and typically it's more than one technology, right? We wouldn't have streaming in the way we have it. There were streaming services that failed in the early 2000s. We wouldn't have Spotify and Apple Music and the other streaming services around the world today if we didn't have smartphones, if we didn't have broadband connectivity to those phones so that we could stream the music, if we didn't have the ability to store the music on the phone so that if you went in the subway system, predating when we have Wi-Fi in the subway today, but we didn't have that when Spotify launched in the US, that the music would keep playing. But if I'm going to store music on the phone and I quit the service, how do I get the music to stop playing? Because you're no longer subscribing. That was part of my job to worry about when I was at Warner Music. So cutting edge technology is always the first thing we talk about in every one of the services. What technologies have to come together? Those audio compression technologies that AT&T, helped to invent, magnetic tape recording that enabled that, obviously the technologies that gave us the birth of the phonograph in the first place. So there's always a group of technologies that come together that enable this new format, if it's going to be the successful one. And once it becomes the dominant format, 5 other parts of the business adjust. And we don't always tell the story in the same order. It just gave us a way to tell the story that didn't necessarily have to be chronological each time. So we talk about creators, the artists themselves. What do they change? Today we have TikTok and we have artists making songs where the hook and the intro come earlier and earlier. Because if you're going to make TikTok videos, you only got 30 seconds and you don't want people to miss. And in streaming, you don't get paid unless it gets listened to for 31 seconds. It doesn't count as a play. So that means that songs like Papa Was a Rolling Stone, which has a lengthy, wonderful introduction that goes on for minutes, typically wouldn't happen today, right? Because they want to hook you into the music right at the start. So how do the creators change? Vinyl records became a template for concept albums, right? Like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, although that may be the one people think of. The first person to make a concept album was Frank Sinatra. He made the first Christmas album on records.
I did not realize that.
This is the second C. Again, artist doesn't work. Channels. How do the distribution channels adjust? Let's pick a specific example. When the CD came out, the industry was selling vinyl and it was selling tapes. And record store says, you want me to sell something else? Besides, I have 2 versions of Michael Jackson's album. Now I have a third. I just updated my store. I don't have racks that can hold this little case for the CD. They actually had to invent something they called the long box that was very wasteful ecologically, that was shaped rectangularly like this, that 2 of them could fit next to each other in the slot for an album. And they have to replace the fixtures in the stores. So channels, consumers, not the word that we love, but fans starts with F, not with C. But, one of the things that tends to happen, and you and I both know this from having been in the tech industry, the early adopters tend to be young, right? They're not set in their ways, right? It's why the stereotype is that you and I need help from our kids to get our smartphones to work, right? You have to ask for advice. And so fans are often young who move to the next thing. And then they also distinguish themselves in what music they like to listen to, because it's always a form of rebellion. Our parents didn't like rock music. We didn't like hip hop music. Right. And it always is that story. And so often the genre of music changes at one of these format changes. A tape enabled people to record their, for hip hop musicians and DJs to record their sets and sell it out the back of the car when the industry wasn't interested in signing hip hop artists because they weren't singers. Right? Of course, today hip hop's the dominant genre in many market segments. So that's third after cutting edge technology. Then there's cash. How do you make money with this thing? And that changes too. Again, we have an industry that makes money from a share of royalties from streaming services today, as opposed to here's the CD that gets sold and you get the wholesale price. If you're the label and your contract defines what you pay the artist as their share of those royalties. And then the last one, which does typically lag, although sometimes it comes sooner, is copyright and regulation, right? So we have that right now with all these fights over training material for AI. And, Bill Rosenblatt and we teach a class based on the book, and we say, we can look over the history. It takes 10 years at a minimum for the law and the regulations to catch up with the changes in technology. That's always what it's taken. Maybe this time it'll be quicker with AI. Chances are it's not, because Congress is slow, if not, slow may be a compliment for what our Congress can do these days. And regulations are slow, and it takes time for these things to evolve and get settled. Just to pick the long ones, the player piano and the piano roll, and then sound recordings on records. It took decades until they put a copyright law in that recognized that a piano roll was a copy and that a record was a copy of the composition as well, because it wasn't readable by a human. That was the argument that was made in court. It was a part of a machine. And as part of a machine, it was not copyrightable.
That's interesting. Well,
so those are the 6 C's, and and then we end the book with turning it. As an engineer, you'll get it orthogonally. We turn it around and say, what are the themes across all the formats? What's the theme of cutting edge technology across all those decades and formats? How did creators change over all those formats? So we sort of tip it on its head and say, what are the things that we can see across all these time periods that have been a constant? And one of the first one is, for technology, convenience always beats quality.
Yeah. Very cool. Oh my goodness. That's such a great analysis, the way that you approach that. And it's like, the last thing you were talking about with the copyright thing, it reminds me so much of, my memories of product technology development. First you just try to get it to work. Then you try to get the quality to be better, so it would work reliably. Then you put in things to be able to manage it if it was some kind of a complex system. And then maybe you worried about security at the end.
Right.
So things like copywriting or, other types of securities. It's like, and products didn't wait for all those stages to take place before they were introduced.
And as we both know, one of the important regulations in consumer electronics is the FCC ruled on the electronic emissions of the product. And so,
yes,
there was always this question of, could you get all that hardware into the box that you were designing for and then pass the test?
Right.
Is the regulation at the end of it.
Absolutely.
And if you failed, you had to go back again.
Gosh. This brings back so many memories. So I'd like to read from a couple of the endorsements for your book. This one's from Francis Moore, CEO of the International Federation of Phonographic Industry, who says, this book is essential reading for those looking to thrive in an ever-evolving music industry. So, as we kind of look forward from, your analysis that, was more looking backwards, what, for instance, is going to be the impact of AI?
If I knew that, I could make even more money than I am. And that is the thing that's keeping me busy these days. I don't think any of us really know for sure. And the reason is, it gets to that copyright issue that's last. The tech companies say that it is fair use, which is one of the items on the copyright law, that allow them to use training material that's publicly available. They don't ever get very specific about exactly what training material they're using. But in fact, I know, as an example, that my book has been used for training AI models. I didn't give permission. I wasn't paid anything for it. I think I ought to have the opportunity to say no, and I ought to have the opportunity to get paid if it becomes an important part of it. So, without that part being settled, it isn't clear, because courts could rule one way or the other, right? We can go look at cases in the past, like Sony's Betamax case that enabled the VCR to thrive, and said that it was fair use to make copies of TV shows. And by the way, that case then played a role in the digital music industry as well, in terms of could people make copies of songs
Personal
and were
use.
they okay to do those kinds of things?
Yeah, yeah.
So, we don't really know. We know it's going to take a while to settle. So we ought to take that into account in our thinking. Um, we know, and this gets back to, I've told people my preference is that and it's not just music, right? There are cases with the New York Times and authors and graphic artists. This affects everybody. Deep fakes for politicians, right? There are lots and lots of ways that AI it can cause trouble. It's not just going to be that you get an email that says, the Nigerian prince needs money. You're going to get a call. You're literally going to get a call that sounds like your son, who says he's been arrested in Alabama and needs money for bail, and you're going to think it's your son, right?
Yeah,
Those
yeah.
kind of frauds are going to happen. People fool people all the time without that technology. So it's
Right.
going to make it worse. And, we're going to see videos up where Taylor Swift is endorsing a political position that she may be completely against. Will the fans know? Will we be able to distinguish the difference? So I'm hopeful that there will be some regulations that come quicker, even if the main issues remain up in the air over fair use. I am hopeful that we'll get some court cases that go in favor of the creators and the rights holders, and also some that maybe help the tech industry, because I think if both sides think there's a chance they could lose big, they'll come to the table. And that's the best outcome, is
Sure.
Let's make a deal, right? I tell people we want a solution in conference rooms and not in courtrooms. But if either side thinks that they're sure to win every court case, they won't compromise.
Yeah.
And that would be unfortunate either way, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the people in the content industry will be slow to enable some of the AI things to occur, perhaps. And on the other side, if they don't think they have to pay, there won't be an acceptable solution on the licensing side. So that to me is what I hope will occur, but we don't know. And every court case could change it, because fair use is very fact specific. They will reference previous cases, but it's always depends on what the judge sees in that particular case on that particular day.
Well, let's talk about the content creation aspect of AI also, right? I mean, it will soon be, if it's not already, the case that it's indistinguishable in many cases as an object, an entity that was created by a human versus created by AI. What is your view on, what that means?
I am a huge proponent of it if it's done with permission and the participation of the artist. And the best example I can cite, and I can get you the link so you can include it in your newsletter, is Randy Travis, the great country artist. 10 years ago, he had a stroke, almost died. He suffers from aphasia now, so he has difficulty speaking. He cannot really perform full songs anymore. But Warner Music Nashville, which is his label, decided to use AI to try and give him his voice back.
Wow. Wow.
The link I will send you is to a CBS News story about this. So it is an incredibly well-produced video.
I think I heard something about that, yeah.
Right. And so with his engineer that he's worked for years, and master tapes from his recordings, they crafted a voice that Randy himself was happy with, his engineer was happy with, and his family was happy with. And the song that they released has been listened to over 6 million times on Spotify. Wow. And his band is now on tour promoting that new music and all his old music. And Randy is part of that. As I said, he can't really sing, but they used another country artist to sing the new song, and then they morphed his voice into Randy's voice using so that singer is fronting the band. And so people who depended on Randy for their livelihood have a livelihood again. And he is making music again, which is something that he devoted his life to. Sure. And I've heard him talk about this. And again, it is sad that it's wonderful that he was able to survive, because literally his wife said they thought they were going to lose him to this stroke. So it's great that he's here. but he lost something that his fans valued so much. And AI was able to bring that back. I'm a huge Linda Ronstadt fan. She can't sing either. I'd love for people to do the same thing, assuming she's okay with it. And as part of the process, I'd love to hear new Linda Ronstadt music. Wouldn't a duet between Linda Ronstadt and Adele be a wonderful thing?
Really?
So there are many things like that. It could help artists who have since passed away. Because again, in the world we live in streaming, if we have fans who don't know who Whitney Houston is, as strange as that might seem, we might reacquaint people with Whitney Houston. We have songs being released in languages that they weren't recorded in. So Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree, the Brenda Lee song from 50 years ago, was released this Christmas season in Spanish.
Through AI?
Through AI, sung by a vocal of Brenda Lee's 16-year-old voice.
Oh my.
Thank goodness. But she doesn't have the same vocal quality she had when she recorded Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree. But there's a Spanish version that we can listen to. So there are wonderful things we can do, but that's very different from I could point you to a site that will give you or sell you a voice model that sounds like Randy Travis. I don't think it has the same quality of what he and his engineer did. And one of the questions is there a copyright in that song? That new song? Obviously the composition has a copyright, but does the recording, which was created with AI, deserve a copyright? Because typically copyright is only granted to humans. This is a human plus a machine. Where's the line of whether this should be granted a copyright or not?
Well, as you said a minute ago, there's a lot of entanglement that it could take a long time to play out, isn't it?
But I like thinking about these things. Again,
yeah.
It's keeps the mind active.
So here's another, or part of another endorsement. This was from Larry Miller, who you mentioned earlier, the clinical professor and director of the NYU Music Business Program. He says, utterly comprehensive, meticulously researched, and completely accessible. So, that's quite an accomplishment given kind of the history and the reach of the music industry. And I know you said earlier that, during COVID, that really gave you an opportunity to do that. But I mean, how long did that take and how did you go about it?
Well, again, both Bill and I had been in the music industry for years, and people were willing to talk to us because they were stuck at home too. So we did a whole bunch of interviews with people ranging from Nick Rhodes of Duran Duran, who I had met on a project that I was on at Warner Music, to Arabian Prince, who was one of the founders of NWA, the hip hop group. So we had contacts that we could go interview and ask questions that were there firsthand. Some of them, the guy at Sony, who was the leader of the team that promoted the CD when it first came out, is somebody that we knew. So, and people were stuck in their houses, so they were probably more willing to say yes than they might have been otherwise if they were out performing. So, we were lucky enough to get them to interview that. And again, the nature of the book was, I can point you to books that are all about the phonograph, or I could point you to a book that's all about copyright through the years. But we were trying to do both of those things at once, right? And so we could read the 6 books about the phonograph, which I did, right? And use that as research for that chapter and through our filter of these 6 C's. And we could also read a book that was about copyright all through the years, right? But didn't necessarily focus on radio only or the CD only. So we had a lot of good sources to use. And we did it. Again, my wife says it kept me sane during COVID because every day I'd sit and read and write, and it takes time to get it just the way you want to get it.
Wow. Well, it's really a fascinating, book and very, very interesting, everything that you kind of consolidated into one. But given all that, what would you like readers to most take away from the book?
I think there are 2 things that, we sort of talked about the big picture, but there's so many fun stories, right? That's the thing. We didn't want this to be only dry and be a textbook, whether it's, I'll pick one out that is really strange. The first, we can think of lots and lots of musical artists who became movie stars, right? Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra. Prince made Purple Rain, right? I mean, we could think of lots. Madonna made movies, right? The very first was Caruso, and they showed him singing. There was a problem, though. It was a silent movie. And they tried to play the record to match up with it. It didn't work. Until Western Electric figured out Sound Pictures
Is
way
that
back in
right?
the day, another Bell company. And so, stories like that of, he was the first attempt to become a movie
Uh,
star, and it didn't quite work because they didn't really have Sound Pictures yet. So
oh
those
my
kind of
God.
stories are fun to tell.
Yes.
Adding, Louis Armstrong dropped his music in a recording session. In the days of the early phonograph, you couldn't edit. You had to start again. When he dropped the music, he started scatting the lyrics. And it became a hit.
Are you serious?
I am
That's
serious.
good. That's good. Well, Howie, thanks so much for doing all that work and for joining us to talk about it. As I said, I could probably ask you questions about all this music history all day, but I appreciate you taking the time and many congratulations on making that book happen.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate all the interest.
Again, the title of the new book is Key Changes, the 10 times technology transformed the music industry. And you can obviously get it on Amazon or Oxford University Press or wherever books are sold. Howie, thanks again.
Thank you. Take care.